Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. In today's episode, we're going to return to taking a look at bees because we've had this honeycomb farm running for a while, and in fact, I've been emptying this farm somewhat regularly, but it honestly produces more honeycomb than I'm currently using. That will all change in future, but in the meantime, there is another product that the bees can help us with, and that is, of course, the honey itself. A while ago, when I made this storage system, I carved out two spaces over here for item filters for honey blocks and slime blocks, and as of right now, we don't really have great access to either. Slime farms are a little bit more in-depth, we can get into those in future, but today, we're going to return to honey blocks, where I have two in the filter and one in the floor, and very little else, but I am surrounded by honeycomb blocks. I've got nearly a full double chest of these right now, and plenty of honeycomb left in this barrel to make candles and wax copper and all sorts of other stuff, so it's time to start putting these bees to work, making us honey as well. And the key difference here, the reason that I've waited this long to create a honey farm, is because a honeycomb farm just needs a bunch of shears, which is easy enough to get once you have an iron farm or a decent vein of iron found underground, whereas bottling honey requires you to get hold of a lot of glass bottles in order to keep the machine running consistently. And guess who has a large quantity of sand that can be turned into glass now? There may not be much sand left in the chest here, but that's because most of it is here in the shulker boxes. I have 9 full shulker boxes of sand that are ready to go into the auto smelter and be turned into glass if we need it. And frankly, I think we need it for this project. So this is really one of those moments where the byproducts from one project, the Guardian farm in this case, can lend themselves to use in the next project, which will be a honey farm. And while we're letting all of that glass smelt in the auto smelter, let's revise what we know about getting hold of bees. Naturally generated bee nests can be found throughout the world in a few different biomes. You are more likely to find them in flower forests, meadow biomes, and cherry groves, since cherry groves and meadow biomes have sparse trees which frequently have bee nests dangling from them. Flower forests like this one will frequently have bee nests dangling from the trees as well, and they will appear less frequently than in meadow biomes, but there are a lot more trees. There are also a lot more flowers for the bees to go out and pollinate from, and once they have acquired some pollen, they will return to their nests. But bee pathfinding is a little bit unreliable. They don't always have the greatest time dealing with obstacles, and sometimes they will simply wander away from their nest looking for new flowers and never return. Once the nest fills up with honey though, it will start to drip from the bottom and the texture will change to show honey leaking out of the sides, and at that point it's ready for harvesting. In order to safely harvest products from a bee nest, whether that is honey or honeycomb, it's best to put a campfire underneath the nest to smoke the bees and make them a little bit more docile. However, if you want to acquire the bee nest, all you need to do is break it with a silk touch tool while the bees are inside. If there are any bees around the outside when you break the hive, they will still get mad. But in this case, you'll notice we got the total bee location advancement for moving a bee nest with 3 bees inside. So we actually had a full nest there, and that's the perfect thing to take back and use in our honey farm. And you'll notice that regardless of whether or not we had a campfire underneath that bee nest, if you end up breaking it with a silk touch tool, you will receive the nest and you won't anger the bees inside. They won't pop out and attack you like they do if you try and get honey or honeycomb without using a campfire first. If you aren't sure whether or not a bee nest is full, the best way to confirm this is to wait until nightfall, because the bees will typically return to the nests or hives at night, at which point it becomes much easier to pick up a bee nest without fear of repercussions and with the assumption that it is full of any bees that will have come in from nearby. If you need to breed bees up, you can always feed 2 of them flowers. In this case, I think one of the bees that was up here from my previous experiments with bees has escaped, so we need to make sure the population here is up to 6. And the baby bees can still work in the same way that the adult bees do. They will still pollinate around flowers and they will still return to the nest in much the same way. These bees, unfortunately, are unable to pollinate up here in my attic space because they don't have any flowers, and you'll notice them trying to pathfind to the flowers that are planted on the outside of the roof here. See, I have a couple of flowers planted up here and even a couple of azalea bushes, in which case the flowering ones can be used to pollinate bees. And you'll notice that I'm talking about the bees being pollinated here and not the flowers, even though in realistic terms it should be the other way around. And that is because bees don't actually do anything to spread flowers, but their pollen, when they collect it, is the thing that produces honey and honeycomb inside of a nest or hive. Once they've been able to do that 5 times, that's when the honey level of the hive will be full enough that you can harvest it for whatever product. And there is no difference between nests and hives, except that the nests can be found naturally and look one way, whereas the hives are manufactured by the player and look a different way. Just to differentiate between the two farms, I would actually really like to make the honey farm out of natural bee nests, and the good news is there is a way that we can get hold of them without having to go out and find them in the wild. And that is by growing a compatible tree within 2 blocks of a flower. If we place birch trees all the way around the outside here, if we grow some birch saplings around this flower, each of these will have a chance to produce a bee nest when it grows. Oak trees, cherry trees, and mangroves are all also compatible trees that will produce bee nests. The main reason I'm using birch trees for this is because they are the simplest to chop down and the one that I harvest the least often. So it's nice to stock up on birch logs by using this opportunity to farm a little birch wood. The trees don't have to grow naturally by themselves, so you can bone meal the tree if you want to grow it. And I think it's usually a good idea to grow these trees a little more separately or to clear out the leaves before you grow the next tree, because I don't think the bee nest, when it generates, will replace any of the existing leaf blocks. So we are reducing the chances of a bee nest spawning here by growing our saplings so close to each other. You don't want to absolutely spam the birch trees. I'm going to break these with fortune so we get a few more birch saplings back. We'll grab a couple more flowers from the field nearby, and we'll grow a bunch of birch saplings in a line spaced 2 blocks apart like this. Sooner or later, one of these birch saplings is going to generate with a bee nest in it, and you'll usually hear the bees pop out of the nest straight away. There we go, we finally got one with a bee nest in it, and there should be 2 bees automatically spawned along with the nest. There we go, there's our second one, and I brought some flowers with me so we can breed them, because the maximum population of a nest is 3, so we want to get a 3rd bee going almost immediately. We'll breed these 2 together, they'll produce a juvenile bee, and then they should return to this nest during the nighttime, at which point we should be able to harvest the nest and add it to our collection. Judging by the height of the campfire smoke in the chimney, the glass is still smelting in there, but once all of that is smelted, we should have enough to fill up 3 dispensers completely full of glass bottles. So I think we will aim to smelt another shulker box of sand and go for 6 dispensers total, which means we're looking to get 6 bee nests. I'm going to continue trying to generate bee nests until we have all 6, and then we'll return for the next part of the video in which we'll build up the farm. Well, I thought that was going to take longer, but amazingly, the next couple of trees I grew generated bee nests in them. So, as soon as we've got all of these bees bred up and safely inside the nests, we can start phase 2 and start building the farm. For the sake of the farm, I'm also going to grow an azalea right here so we can harvest some more flowering azalea leaves. And with night falling, all of these bees should soon return to their nests. We're going to harvest each of these once again using a silk touch tool, and I'll stash the nests away in here while I explain how to set up the farm. Much as it might make sense to build this near our honeycomb farm, I've noticed behavior in the past where bees can actually get attached to flowers that they can't pathfind to, and so I don't want to risk the flowers inside this honeycomb farm affecting the AI of the bees inside the honey farm. So we're actually going to build them as 2 separate structures. And I think over here by the factory is going to be a good place for that. We'll also remove some of the flowers from around the outside here, since these are all plains flowers that weren't placed here deliberately, so it makes sense to move them. Now, I brought a handful of wood with me. We're going to break some of this down into planks, and some of those are going to be turned into barrels. We're also going to need 2 hoppers for each bee nest we want to include in the farm, so I brought 12 of those with me. Now, to set up the farm, we're going to imagine that each of these logs is a bee nest. We don't want to place them right away because during the day the bees will just be able to fly out of the nests. But immediately underneath each of these we want to place a hopper, and we're probably going to have those output into a chest. So let me quickly make another chest here. We'll put a double chest on the front of the farm like this where we can collect all of the honey bottles, and we'll make sure that there are hoppers facing into the chest and underneath each of these adjoining hives. We're going to place a temporary block 1 block above each of the nests or hives, and we're going to have some dispensers facing down into those. These dispensers are going to be full of glass bottles, and the mechanic for bottling honey using a dispenser works very similarly to bottling water to put in the mud farm. If a dispenser is full up of empty glass bottles, when it bottles some honey, it would normally retract it into the dispenser and save it in one of these dispenser slots, but since it will have nowhere to go, it simply spits out the honey bottle instead, and it will spit it out into the block space of the hive or nest itself, at which point the hopper below should be able to pick it up. To make sure that a constant supply of glass bottles is fed back in, we're going to have some hoppers over the top with some barrels over the top of those. And the cool thing about this design is that the glass bottles can be recycled back into the farm, because if we retrieve the glass bottles from this chest, once we've turned the honey into honey blocks, we get the empty glass bottles back, so that we can just put them back in the barrels, evenly distributed, so that each of them will have a full supply of glass bottles again. Now comes the redstone part. So we're going to put a row of building blocks along the back of here, adjacent to the hoppers, and a set of comparators is going to be reading the honey level of each of our bee nests. I can actually demonstrate this using our honeycomb farm as long as some of these beehives in here have a honey level. Right, this one here does. We can detect the honey level by using a comparator, which will output a signal equivalent to the number of honey levels in this nest or hive. Notice that this has a honey level of 2, and this is outputting a redstone signal strength of 2. When that redstone signal reaches 5, you know that the hive is full. And so each of the comparators attached to the backs of the nests here is going to be reading that honey level. If this dispenser is activated before the honey level reaches 5, it will simply output an empty glass bottle, and that will go in the chest, and that glass bottle will kind of be wasted until we put it back in the system. So instead, we're going to make sure that the dispenser only activates when the honey level inside the nest reaches 5. To do that, we're going to have the comparator output into this To do that, we're going to have the comparators first output into a block, which should maintain the signal strength output by the comparator. Then the first line of redstone dust we're going to lay here will only activate when the comparator has a signal strength of 1. Then the first line of redstone dust we're going to lay here will activate once the comparator reaches a signal strength of 1. We're going to have this run up a block into another line of redstone dust. This will activate on honey level 2. Then over the top of this first line of redstone dust, we're going to add some glass, because this will allow us to wrap the redstone wire back around without disconnecting it from the blocks below. That right there will activate on honey level 3, and so the next 2 blocks we place, once we cover those with redstone dust, are going to activate on the next 2 honey levels 4 and finally 5. So once the honey level in the nest reaches 5, it's going to power this block here, which will power the dispenser, and that's when the glass bottle will be ejected. It will bottle the honey from the nest and be pushed down into this hopper where it will be collected in the chest. And it has just occurred to me that we will need to move this chest after all. We'll have the chest directly underneath here because, of course, the bees will need to pollinate from something, and that's going to be a row of azalea leaves placed here. You could also place grass blocks with flowers on top of them, but that will prevent this style of farm from working in Minecraft Bedrock Edition, since bees do need a completely empty air block in order to leave the nest. On Java Edition they don't, or at least they don't count a block with a flower on top of it as being occupied by something that doesn't let them leave. But either way, this pad of flowering azalea leaves is going to be enough for the bees to pollinate and then return directly to the nest. And so that they don't wander off, we are going to surround this entirely with a wall of glass. We're going to put glass over the top here as well, and so that we can load the nests into this machine, we are going to leave a couple of these blocks replaced with slabs instead. We'll put a slab here and a slab here for now, and adult-sized bees should not be able to make it out of this gap. So that way it should be possible for us to reach in, break these logs, and replace them with the bee nests we have gathered one at a time. Of course, if the chest underneath here is a little bit awkward for us to reach, we can always add a couple extra hoppers and bring the chest forward a couple of blocks so it's in front of the farm instead of under it. One other thing I recommend doing for now, especially if you've been breeding bees when you obtain the bee nests, is to surround the farm with a few more solid blocks, because the younger bees, when they grow into full-size bees, can potentially glitch through the corners of these blocks. So it just helps to make sure that they are properly contained inside a solid wall. But I gathered up the other 2 bee nests from the attic of our starter house, and we can now put all 6 of these bee nests into the farm. I might also wait till nighttime in order to do that, because it is less likely that the bees will come out, and that will also mean that any of the smaller bees can't get underneath this half-block gap. While I'm waiting for that to happen, I might actually add a couple of extra hoppers to this, and we can split the farm output into 2 double chests. Since the honey bottles will only stack to 16 and the empty bottles stack to 64, it's unlikely that this chest is going to fill up all the way before we come here and get the empties, and even then, the empties should not completely drain out of these dispensers to the point where we would need to replace the bottles in there. Either way, before we add the bees to the farm, we should also run back and grab some glass from the smelter so that we can turn all of that into glass bottles and start to load up these dispensers. Okay, it's nighttime and a few mobs are out, but I think we have enough room to work here. So I'm going to start converting the glass into glass bottles. I'll throw all of this extra junk in here so we have a little bit more room to convert these, because the glass should convert in a 1-to-1 ratio. You need 3 glass, but you get 3 glass bottles back. So a full shulker box of glass should be enough for us to fill up the first 3 dispensers. Instead, we're going to use it to fill up all 6 dispensers, but remember that the bottles need to be distributed evenly. Otherwise, you risk honey bottles making their way back into the dispenser. So each of these dispensers now has enough glass bottles in it to make sure that the empty slots won't start appearing for a while. And before that, we can go to our furnace, grab the rest of the glass, and make sure that everything else is all filled up. With that taken care of, we can go back to the shulker box, grab our 6 bee nests, and simply use those to replace the logs inside of here one at a time. It is much better to do this at night, and it sounded like one of the bee nests when we put it in there was full of honey and actually clicked. And yes, we do have a honey bottle in here along with the oak logs that were collected by the hoppers. So at least we know the redstone mechanism works. We can replace these 2 slabs with glass blocks. They weren't super necessary because we were filling up the farm at night, but obviously at night it's a little bit more risky if you built it out in the open like I have here. But now, having gone to bed and skipped the night, we should be able to see our farm in operation. And it looks like some of the bees are out. Some of them may already have popped out, pollinated, and gone back in. But as you can see, they are going wild for the azalea. The flowers on there actually allow them to pollinate, and then they should pop back into the hive. And if we look around the side here, yes, we should start to see that some of these comparators are lighting up to indicate that the honey level of the hive is increasing. It will only increase when the bees exit the hive again, so they do need to make sure that they can go in and out in order to increase the honey level. But right now we actually have 1 bottle in each. Okay, so one of the honey levels when we transplanted the hive here was high enough that it was able to produce another honey bottle very, very quickly, which is great. And once the bees start popping out of the farm, we should hear a couple of those dispensers activating again. There we go. And now we have 3 bottles in there and 3 in there. So of course, 4 honey bottles is what is required to turn into a honey block. We can get the empty bottles back from the crafting process and pop those up there in the barrels. An alternative to the barrels, if you wanted to make sure that the empty glass bottles are distributed evenly throughout these, is to use a hopper minecart system or a chest minecart in order to go back and forth over the top of the hoppers, dropping off 1 bottle at a time. But ultimately, the goal here is to have enough glass bottles in the system that it doesn't really matter which barrel you put the glass bottles back into. As long as you don't always fill the left-hand barrel or something like that, they're always going to have enough. Now, a question you might still have here is, why do we care this much about honey blocks? Why go to all this trouble? And the answer to that is pretty simple, actually. Mechanically speaking, honey blocks are one of the more interesting blocks in the game. They're quite a cool looking block. They have 1 pixel of transparency around the outside with a more solid center, but they are still transparent through the center as well, so you can sort of see behind and through them. As you might expect, honey blocks are sticky, and if you jump up and down on them, it reduces your jump height. You're not really able to jump off of a honey block in the same way that you can any other block. You can also interact with honey blocks in interesting ways, like if you jump against the side of them, you slide down them instead of falling. So if I create a vertical tower of honey blocks, I can actually step off the side of this, slide down it, and you get an advancement for doing that. Sticky situation, where you jump into a honey block to break your fall. You can also jump into the side of a honey block while you're traveling horizontally, and you can sort of do the equivalent of a wall run. You won't keep your height as much, but you will be able to travel a little bit further if you're pressed up against the side of a wall of honey blocks. It decreases your fall speed, but you can keep your forward momentum that way, which is a kind of a neat thing to introduce into a parkour challenge. But perhaps one of the most useful properties of honey blocks is their ability to have items stick to them. We can activate a sticky piston here, which will push and pull the honey block around. But if we place, let's say, a redstone lamp attached to this, it's going to push and pull the redstone lamp along with it. Slime blocks will also do this, but we'll take a look at slime blocks in future. Let's say we want to activate and deactivate this redstone lamp. We can push it on and off a redstone torch like that, and that will turn the lamp on and off. You can even set up a chain by which pushing this honey block allows it to push this piston, which will push out this honey block. But then unfortunately this chain cannot be retracted afterwards because you can't pull a sticky piston while its piston head is extended. But there are a variety of ways you can work around that, and chaining together pistons and honey or slime blocks is a really interesting way of moving blocks around. The other really useful thing while we're comparing honey blocks and slime blocks is that they do not stick to each other, so you can have two pushable parts with blocks stuck to them moving completely independently of each other, even if the design is tiled side by side, which makes them really useful for opening and closing piston doors and other contraptions like that. But one thing honey blocks have in their favor which slime blocks don't is the ability to move entities with them. Entities like dropped items or even mobs will stick to the top of a honey block and be moved around when the honey block moves, which is not the case with slime blocks. I can stand on this honey block, and when I flick the lever, I moved 1 block away. In the case of a slime block, the slime block itself would move, but the player would stay where they were, and you'd probably end up falling through the gap in the piston texture here, whereas with the honey block, the block takes you with it. In future, we will look at flying machines that can be made with both honey and slime blocks that will allow you to move mobs, entities, blocks, and other things around. But for the moment, it's just a really good thing to have a reliable source of honey in this world, so I'm going to return to this farm frequently to make sure that we get all of the honey blocks that we can and empty the glass bottles back into the system. Eventually, we might even have enough honey blocks that we can start to build cool stuff with them as well, taking advantage of that neat transparent texture and the kind of glowing orange that they have. Let's not forget that honey bottles are also a food source. You can drink honey bottles even when you're not hungry, which means you can refill your saturation, and the honey bottle will remove the poison status effect if you've been poisoned by cave spiders or a splash potion thrown by a witch, or even bees when you've been handling them. So now we have a honey farm, I expect we're going to be able to do some really cool stuff with it in future. But folks, that is where we're going to leave this episode of the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you've enjoyed this look at honey farms, and I'm so happy that we finally have one of these in this world. Thank you so much for watching. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care, bye for now.